Overmold discs come in all shapes and sizes, but while MVP made them mainstream in recent years, overmolds aren't new. But why make overmold discs in the first place? Today we're testing and comparing several different overmolds to understand why. Because the plastic is in the details. Nearly every disc on the market is a solo mold disc like this one, a solid piece of plastic. Overmold discs, though, are different. While the majority of the flight plate and then just part of the rim are a solo mold disc, through a variety of processes, an additional layer or piece of plastic is then added to the rim. But with anything like this, the question is why? Why go to the trouble of adding another step to the production process? Well, it all boils down to weight, or specifically weight distribution. Discs are able to fly because of gyroscopic stability generated by spin, which we've covered in detail in previous videos. Without it, the wing of a disc generates lift, and discs will just fly up, flip over, and fall down. Now, this gyroscopic stability exists with every disc golf disc. The rim is thicker than the rest of the disc, there's more weight out on the rim, you spin the disc when you throw it, and it creates stability, or a stable flight. But overmold discs look to increase this weight distribution by using even lighter plastic in the center and heavier, denser plastic along the outside rim. But as I said before, the methods to do that are quite different. MVP Disc Sports, which is by far the most mainstream overmold on the market these days, uses chemical bonding to adhere an ultra-dense, heavy overmold to the outside of the disc's core. They define the core as the flight plate and about the inner half of the rim. This visual perfectly illustrates the main concept behind overmolds. MVP's first overmold disc, the Ion, was approved by the PDGA way back in 2009. You can also find their overmold technology in use in their spin-off sister brand Axiom discs. The only difference here is that Axiom's overmolds have dye added, so instead of being all black like MVP, you get some really cool color combinations. One of the things that makes MVP's discs immediately identifiable are these little manufacturing marks along the side. You find these small, flat rectangles where the overmold plastic was either injected or a piece of plastic stuck out and was then removed during the manufacturing process. We've used this small detail to identify other brands made by MVP. Because of course their solo mold line of streamlined discs carry these same small marks, as do several other brands that they produce discs for, including Thought Space Athletics, Mint Discs, Jester Disc Golf, and Remix Disc Golf. Over the course of making this video, we discovered another company's discs with these same manufacturing marks, Latitude 64, and this presents quite a few questions. Now, if you're newer to disc golf, you may not be familiar with Latitude 64's overmolds, and there's a good reason for that. They were discontinued in 2019, just 2 years after their introduction in 2017. Their overmold project kicked off with 3 discs: the Sarek, a putter, the Gobi midrange, and the Bryce fairway driver. Later on, they would add another midrange, the Fuji, as well as another fairway driver, the Zion. And this is interesting because these are the first overmolds outside of the MVP family that we've ever found with those same manufacturing marks. But there's something else very different about Latitude 64's Opto G overmolds, and that is the plastic. MVP's overmolds use a variety of plastics for the flight plate, but the same durable overmold plastic for each. Latitude 64, though, opted instead to just use 2 of their premium plastics. Their translucent plastic Opto is for the core and flight plate, and their opaque premium gold line for the overmold. These overmolds were introduced by Latitude 64 during a particularly experimental phase. Around this time, they also introduced the Hex line. The 2 discs in the Hex line were the Michelin and Rakuten, and they used a new technology, which they called Hex, that added a textured hexagonal pattern to the discs, and left a small area unchanged for the thrower to grip the disc. But the idea here was to create less drag, mirroring the effects of the dimples on a golf ball. Ultimately, though, Latitude 64 found both of these technologies more trouble than they were worth. When they were discontinued after just 2 years, Latitude 64's CEO, David Berglund, said, quote, "The overmold project was an exciting technology that we enjoyed mastering. The visuals were certainly pleasing. However, our tests show that the actual benefits in disc flights are not enough to make a noticeable difference. Besides that, the Overmold technology presented us with inconsistency problems. From now on, we'll be fully focused on making the best flying, most consistent, and good-looking discs in one piece. Now, the fact that they consider the benefits of overmolding to be effectively zero, I think is something that certainly MVP might contest. And I think this also boils down to the fact that they didn't use a higher density plastic for the outside rim. You're not really going to get any benefit on the overmold by using just another premium plastic on the outer edge. MVP uses that thick, super dense black or multicolor stuff with Axiom, and that does increase the weight distribution. How much though? Hard to say. This does though feel like the perfect time to take a break from the history of overmolds to see how a couple of these overmold discs fly. So let's compare these Latitude 64 mid-ranges to a modern MVP overmold mid-range, the Hex, and the quintessential solo mold mid-range, the Discraft Buzz. Now, to be clear, we're not necessarily just trying to compare the flight paths because of course the Fuji is rated more overstable than the rest of these, but I think it will tell us a little bit about whether they got any of that overmold gyroscopic benefit or not, and see how they fly compared to some popular modern mid-ranges. Now we're throwing these discs in a little bit of a tailwind, so we're expecting them to have a little more stability than normal, especially laid on. Let's start out with the Fuji. Rated at 4402, the Fuji flies great. On hyzer, with some power, it flips up to flat and holds before a very reliable fade. The Gobi though, rated at 5.5, -0.51, isn't really that different to the Fuji. For my lower arm speed, the flight looks a lot like Caleb's power throw with the Fuji, holding straight for a moment before it fades out. For Caleb though, the Gobi does get a little bit more turn, but even still, it manages to find some low speed fade. Let's compare that to a brand new Neutron Hex. The Hex holds straight for a while before a similar low speed fade. The Discraft Buzz though definitely seems a tad straighter, at least in this plastic and wind conditions, getting a little bit more drift before that fade kicks in. Despite being discontinued about 5 years ago, the Opto G line from Latitude 64 is still very popular. The Gobi and Fuji in particular will still fetch over $40 on Facebook and eBay. Now, while the Gobi and Fuji are characterized as straight, of course, depending on how you throw them, another overmold disc trying to achieve the same thing is the Tomahawk from Yikun. The Tomahawk is one of 3 overmolds available from Yikun, all of which we'll be looking at today. Yikun's overmolds, though, are quite a bit different from what we've seen so far. From the top, you can see there's a section where part of the overmold overlaps the core plastic. Yikun calls the core plastic tortoise and the overmold shell, and we see what they did there. But if you flip the disc over, there's something quite different to what we see on the MVP or Latitude overmolds. There is a hole through the flight plate, which they've used to affix the overmold to the core. And the same thing is on the bottom of the Meteor Hammer putter from Yikun. And this is just wild. Even more wild when you check out the bottom of their overmold driver, the Twin Swords, because apparently with that extra speed, they needed extra holes. 6 to be exact. Even more wild. All right, back to the Tomahawk though. Rated at 5600, it has a crazy shape, a super pointy overmold rim. It's really, really deep, but I've seen discs of this shape fly fairly straight. So, all right, okay. Well, Caleb has a lot of power and torque, and maybe if I throw it really smooth, okay, that's a little bit better. So the Tomahawk is super understable, even in a tailwind, but what about the Meteor Hammer? Well, it's also supposed to be straight. It's rated at 2300, and it looks and feels sort of just like a smaller Tomahawk, but with a slightly less sharp wing shape. Luckily for us and fans of disc comparisons everywhere, there is another overmold putter rated with the same flight numbers that uses a totally different approach to overmolding, the Nova from Innova. The Nova is one of only 2 overmolds made by Innova, the other being the Atlas mid-range. Innova's overmold is in what they call XT plastic, which is a combination of a grippy and durable overmold rim and a tacky but firm flight plate. that feels something between DX plastic and R Pro. And the way that the overmold is connected to the disc is once again super different. There are 18 spots along the top of the overmold where you can both see and feel where the plastics intersect. On the bottom, there are 4 spots along the inside rim where you can, once again, see and feel the intersection point. And there's also 4 of these, I'm not really sure what to call this, but it is a sizable protrusion of plastic. And given how much I've heard people grumble about the embossed text on the inside rim of a Discraft disc, I can only assume some people are going to have a big problem with all these little inconsistencies in the disc's surface. But never mind all that. While that's interesting, what people really want to know, as usual, is how does the disc fly? And after Caleb's power and torque was too much for the Tomahawk, I think I'll try to take the lead on this one. The Meteor Hammer is, unsurprisingly, still pretty understable, but it's not quite as intense as that Tomahawk, so maybe a little more useful. The Nova, though, is much straighter. Off the tee, it flips up to flat, but not much further, holding straight for the most coveted shot shape in disc golf, straight. Perhaps the most impressive thing about the Nova is that even for Caleb's arm speed, it was straight. And even though we didn't need Caleb to throw the Meteor Hammer, here it is aggressively turning over for him. But perhaps Yikun's drivers can redeem their unconventional overmolding approach. Let's see. We have their twin swords in 2 plastics, the standard tortoise as well as the tortoise fruit, which is clearly a totally different plastic blend. It actually feels very similar to the Phoenix Star June that we threw in a recent Flight Numbers Don't Matter video. And the approach to overmolding is, once again, different. This time, it just looks like they drilled some holes right through the disc. And I'm not saying that any of these methods are better or worse than another, it's just interesting to see how different the approaches are. Let's take a look at how these fly, and I for one am glad that we had 2 different plastics, because the Tortoise Twin Sword on hyzer flips up to flat, gets a brief turn to the right, and then finds some stability before fading out, while the Fruit Twin Swords on a similar hyzer release does not flip at all. Instead, it holds that hyzer angle for a big fade. Honorable mention too to the Twin Swords on forehand, because I think both flew pretty well. And while I'm not sure that I got the nose angle just right on the Twin Swords, it did feel really good on forehand, so it's a disc I wouldn't be upset about experimenting with a little bit more in the future. All of this takes us to our last, oldest, and most unusual overmold by far, the Quest AT Odyssey, mid-range, and driver. I'll try to explain. Now this one is a bit complicated. There is very little information on this disc online. According to Infinite Discs, there is not an Odyssey mid-range, only a distance driver. But of course, the disc clearly says mid-range and driver. QuestAT.com, as the disc lists here on the bottom, is no longer active. But let's talk about what we do know. The Odyssey was approved for Quest Applied Technologies by the PDGA in 2006. And as it says here, it's made in the USA. By who? Who knows? But let's talk about what we can see. This is a very unusual overmold. Most overmolds these days are a small piece of plastic right out on the rim, but the Odyssey is super thick. And then it has another heavy, thick piece of overmold that's holding that inner flight plate to the overmold. The overmold itself is a somewhat grippy, very dense, firm rubber, which feels most closely to MVP's black overmold plastic. Now, I'm not sure how it's supposed to fly. It doesn't have flight numbers. I can't find any information about it. But based on our experience, it's both smooth at holding a line, but also not at all torque resistant and can be turned over with ease. When I initially set out to work on this video and learn about overmolds, I expected to throw a bunch of MVP discs and call it a day. And while it isn't super surprising that other companies have tried to make overmolds, it's fascinating to see all the different ways that they approach the same concept. What do you think of overmolds? Do you throw any? Leave a comment down below. And also comment below what plastic-related things we should test in the future. For Six Sided Discs, I'm Greg. We'll see you in the next one. Now these overmolds were introduced with latitudes, getting that little bit more right. getting that little bit more drift before that speed will hit. Now this gyrostop, so the Yukon Tomahawk is super understable, even in a tailwind. Definitely nowhere near what we were getting with the other ones. Okay. Perhaps the most impressive thing about perhaps Yukon's drivers can redeem. Let's take a look at how these flies and if you like this content and want to see more, please consider liking the video, subscribing to our channel, or supporting us on Patreon. Your support makes this content possible.